April's Tynwald sitting marked one of the rare occasions where it bled into a third day, not least because of one of the items on Manx Care's mandate and operating plan, which soaked up more than 10 hours of the sitting. It was a fairly standard question time to kick off the sitting and began with a start question about tariffs, but it's fair to say the current global economic climate is one of uncertainty, and it's probably also fair to say that no amount of experience or education at Harvard, Cambridge, the London School of Economics, or even UCM could allow anyone to really predict what Donald Trump is going to do next. But that didn't stop backbenchers posing questions, asking the Chief Minister to determine exactly that. Could Alfred Cannon really know what the short and long-term implications could be for the Isle of Man, while trillions had been wiped off the stock market in a matter of days across the globe? Or should he be given some leeway for likely being just as confused as everyone else?
I mean, it's really very hard to know. I mean, the position has shifted hugely over the last couple of weeks, and continues to be a source of, I think, consternation. Clearly for the markets and for investors, and indeed for countries. So, all we can do at the moment is sit tight, wait and see what happens. I mean, I think the important thing to say to everybody is this is about tariffs on goods rather than on services. The Isle of Man's economy is predominantly a service industry. So the direct impact on local businesses is not likely to be significant. But there are a handful of businesses, single-digit numbers that I'm aware of, that have trade relations with the US and may then subsequently be impacted. But it's far too early to jump to conclusions at this point, Phil. And we continue to watch with interest, and we do have lines of communication open with the United Kingdom about these matters.
I suppose one thing that is becoming certain is that these trade wars that particularly Donald Trump seems to be initiating are having a fairly detrimental impact in relation to growth in global economics.
Yeah, you do see indirect impacts in terms of that market performance on a daily basis. You can see the Isle of Man government's investments, and if you go onto the government website, you can actively see where the investments and how they are performing are doing. They will have taken a hit over the last couple of weeks, and the markets continue to fluctuate. So we do see indirect impacts, but we've seen this before, whether it be COVID, whether it be financial crises, or various other events that take place. The markets take fright at times, but normally come back, and we take a long-term view in terms of our investment policies. And I think the Treasury Minister was quick on his feet this morning to remind everybody of that. But it's a period of uncertainty. We are very interested in what's going on, but of course it's not necessarily matters that are within our direct control at the moment. And once things have settled down, once we're clear on the picture in front of us in terms of these tariffs, then we'll be in a better place to make judgment calls about what likely impacts are there on the businesses that are doing goods trades with the US, and where else there may be other opportunities for our economy.
I suppose the thing that isn't helpful about all of this is that you are trying to grow the economically active population. You're trying to encourage businesses to invest in the Isle of Man. And I guess all this global uncertainty is impacting on that. Probably people might be thinking, well, I'll wait and see what happens before I commit to anything.
Well, again, what I would say is that actually, when you look back historically, from a private sector perspective, from a financial services perspective, there has been evidence actually in periods of global uncertainty, the financial services sector has actually benefited, whether that be increases in deposit bases or other opportunities that open up for investors. And of course, the private sector will be very carefully studying the impact of these tariffs, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of astute business people out there who are looking at the opportunities for their investment portfolios or where they may seek to be able to develop opportunities. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it is a negative. I think there is clearly impacts. I know that pensioners, private pensioners with significant investments will be worried. I know investors in the stock market will be potentially taking a hit. I know obviously we'll be tracking things carefully from our perspective, but these are generally short-term impacts, and we do need to see how things play out over the medium to longer term. So we have to hold our nerve, and frankly, we need to control the things we can control. But in this particular case, we do not have any significant control at all over how these tariffs are being set, but we do continue to communicate with the UK.
So you're not intending to introduce a 100% tariff on American goods or anything like that?
Well, again, we have as much as I might wish to do that, we have a customs agreement with the United Kingdom, so we'll be working with our United Kingdom partners in terms of tariffs and customs and excise.
An air of cautious optimism there from the Chief Minister over those global trade tariffs, reiterating realistically the Isle of Man and much of the world has little to no influence over Trump's perhaps erratic decision-making, though the White House has insisted the 90-day pause was always part of the plan. Well, let's turn our attention to Douglas Central MHK Chris Thomas's questions about Tynwald, which most people will probably know as the old nurses' home.
I would like to ask the Minister for the Treasury how, by whom and at what rent the Tynwald apartments will be let, whether he expects rent income to cover costs and how any deficiency will be financed.
Go on, Gervais Shokatashti to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question. Following a tender process, Cowley Groves has been appointed the letting and management agent for the Tynwald apartments. Rental rates will start at £795 per month for a one-bedroom department and from £1,100 per month for a two-bedroom department. There will also be rental income from the commercial unit on the ground floor. Based on the business case presented to Treasury, the Manx Development Corporation are not expecting a deficiency between rental income and the ongoing running costs.
Treasury Minister Alex Allinson delivering that answer there. Well, let's just put what this project is all about in a bit more context for you. In essence, Cowley Groves has been confirmed as the sole lettings and managing agent for the redevelopment of the former nurses' home. That project is expected to be completed by early next year. But let's hear some more from Chris Thomas, who says he believes Tynwald members were misled into subsidising the development of private sector rentals via the public purse.
Originally for public sector key worker, it now seems like it's for every key worker. There's going to be pretty difficult responsibility in terms of allocating. It's going to be pretty difficult coming up with a fair rental policy. And these are the things that Douglas Corporation has been doing for a century and other local authorities have been doing for tens of years. And it has been a tradition that the local authority will do things inside its own area. There's a long tradition in the Isle of Man of local authorities providing housing for new teachers, for new health service workers, and it's all inside the 1955 Housing Act. So, I now need to be presided. What it seems to me is that what we've done is the public purse has paid, we were told today, for private rental apartments to be developed, and I don't think that's what the public were expecting, and it's certainly not what I was expecting.
What the Treasury Minister did say, though, was that he looked recently and could only find 4 private sector rentals in the whole of Douglas.
And he's made it even harder now because the public purse has subsidised the development of public sector rentals, and that's going to make it even harder for the private sector to meet that obvious demand that's there. And so all of a sudden we've got competition issues between the public sector and the private sector. In January, the Competition Act came into force. We've got to treat everybody equally, whether they're public sector or private sector, and all of today we actually had the admission that what the government had done, and I don't think with Tynwald approval on its own bat, it's developed apartments for private rental, which is not what I believe we thought we were using that money for. The second issue that I raised was the one about parking. Parking is a perennial issue in lots of parts of the island, but particularly in that part of Douglas. And in March 2024, go back and look at the Manx radio story of the Tynwald statement. The Minister of Infrastructure said that people inside Westmoreland Village wouldn't be eligible to apply for residence parking permits. Today, the Minister basically said she didn't mean the nurses' home, she just meant the rest of the development around there, which she now terms Westmoreland Village differently from the Tynwald building. I just think that's disingenuous, and essentially what I heard and what the people around there will hear is that you can't trust anything that the ministers are saying these days. And I do think it's only fair to the prospective tenants, 200 of them, who are very excited about having potential new homes, that they realise there is a possibility that they won't have parking permits associated with their apartments, because that is possible under law. And there are examples around Douglas where people don't have a right to apply for a parking permit even though they live in a certain area.
Is it possible, though? I mean, you're saying you can't trust anything ministers say, but ministers are allowed to change their mind, presumably. Ministers are allowed to become better briefed and actually give answers that are more reasonable and more in line with what the law says.
No, of course they can, but as I said, the law allows for parking permits to be available according to the terms of those parking permits. There are examples of properties, and I gave two, the New Douglas Council apartments in Peel Road are constrained in terms of residence parking permits. Central apartments at the end of the Broadway and on the promenade are constrained. There are examples. It's perfectly lawful not to do it, and definitely the impression was given to the local MHKs, I believe, to the public, that the parking wouldn't be made any worse in that area because this was a 20-minute urban concept whereby people would get buses and would walk and cycle. They wouldn't have cars parked outside. That was the whole point of it. It was a landing pad.
But today's answer basically is saying actually that's no longer going to be the case, and that actually they can apply for residence permits.
But you know what they've heard from this politician, the public, is that this politician at least thinks that we've been led down the garden path. I'm not going so far as yet to say misled, because to be fair to the minister, she did say she go away and look at the planning conditions. But definitely the impression was given that this was landing pad, 20-minute village concept for bike users, walkers, people using public buses, public sector key workers, nurses, low paid particularly, for students graduating and returning to the island, their home, or for new students coming here, all those sorts of things. And today we were told that it seems that the public purse has been used to pay for the development of rentals in the private sector.
And your third question?
My third area is just a more general one about how we link all of this to finances and the state of how much borrowing government's got and how much reserves it's got and how those reserves are available to be used. And again, to connect it to the former nurses' home, that is financed from a loan facility from Lloyds Bank. And I believe that loan facility limits the amount of borrowing that government can make elsewhere. And so therefore, by government guaranteeing and agreeing to the terms of that loan facility to finance Manx Development Corporation, effectively government is using up the headspace for it to borrow more money, for instance, for houses, for local authorities, for instance, for other income generating capital projects. And I want to make sure we go into this with our eyes open, with the public knowing what's going on, rather than things having been done in secret behind closed doors, which seems to have been what's happened with former nurses' home development.
And you were suggesting that the organisation that does reviews of the financial standing of Isle of Man government had got its figures wrong?
Well, today I got a very clear answer that we have 660 million and thereabouts of formal government debt. That's in the form of 3 bonds issued for the Water Board, then for the Electricity Board, and then in 2021 the General Sustainable Bond. On top of that, there are contingent liabilities towards the local authority housing loans and the Manx Development Corporation loan facility and various other facilities. It's quite clear in the published Moody's credit opinion from December 2024 that they say the Isle of Man government borrowed for the first time in 2021, and they borrowed 400 million. Then they do all their calculations based on the fact that we've got 400 million of government debt. They do mention the other facilities, and it is true that the Manx Utilities most often pays most of the money for the other 260 million bonds. But as I pointed out, back at the end of the last administration, we wrote off 95 million of internal debt for the Manx Utilities so that they had a reduced amount of debt to keep electricity prices down. And during the post-COVID period, the gas price rise, we sort of effectively allowed Manx Utilities to spend tens of millions of its reserves on keeping the electricity price low. So to me, I would like to be honest with ourselves about the debt, and I cast that in terms of making sure that lenders to us and the credit agencies that help lenders lend to us are actually completely openly informed about our real financial situation. We do now have £1 billion of actual debt and liability which is contingent on something else happening. That's double what it was 5 years ago, and we need to take into account that we've got all of that debt, and it's greater than it's twice as much as our free reserves in the General Reserves Fund, and we're spending our General Reserves 100 million plus each year at the moment. So the Isle of Man is not quite in the rosy position that I want it to be, and therefore we've got to be realistic with the electorate, and we've got to make policies and approve expenditure to actually deal with real things that we need. We've got lots and lots of capital requirements, never mind those for healthcare and for education, and we need to make sure that we're open, honest with ourselves and thus with the public that we represent.
So I guess that you don't believe that Treasury is being open and honest?
Treasury is more of a big spend, big government policy mindset at the moment than I believe we can afford in the Isle of Man, and we need to rein that back in. I'm not. Basically, I believe in public service, but we've got to be open about what we can afford, and we can't become big government, big spend, big taxation in our island.
So are you or aren't you saying that Treasury aren't being open in relation to this matter?
Treasury Minister is always going to big up the positives and downplay the negatives. He's doing that too much at the moment. We can't. Famously, in a budget speech a while back, I talked about the knockers of government, and I'm not a knocker of government as such, but I don't want people to be bullish and too optimistic about things that they shouldn't be optimistic about.
Yep, I'll be honest, I was very confused when I heard Chris Thomas say he was talking about knockers, but I had to double take there. No, that was knockers of government, those who are critical of things that the government does. Douglas North's John Wannenberg tends to keep things brief. In his question, he asked, well, here, have a listen.
I would like to ask the Minister for Treasury, what progress has there been made regarding an immigration health surcharge for new residents? If an implementation date has been decided, and if not, why not? What the forecast of revenue will be, and whether it will be applied retrospectively?
What we found out is that Treasury intends to introduce a health surcharge for new residents before the end of the current administration. We're told legislative changes will be required to bring the measure into force, and he says the existing legal framework wouldn't allow the levy to be introduced more quickly. It would only apply to new residents, though we're not sure how many years you'd have to live here before you're not classed as a new resident. It's estimated that surcharge could generate around £600,000 for Manx Care, though. But let's head back to Mr. Wannenberg, who was asked why he asked the question, and perhaps in classic John Wannenberg style, this is what he said.
Because I wanted to know the answer, Phil.
That's helpful. You must have had some other motivation than just wanting to know the answer. What was your motivation behind asking the question?
Well, threefold, really. It's my understanding that people who come here at the moment do not pay a surcharge. And so it's all very well for people to come here, then take advantage, if you like, of the health service without having contributed towards it. And I think there's a fundamental flaw in that system that needs to be sorted out. And that was the reason for the question. But of course, my question is nothing new. Mrs. Christian brought a motion on this a while ago, and I believe other members have asked. But I wanted an update as to what the situation was.
And what was the answer?
Well, there was a lot said, but I'm not sure that there was a lot answered, if you like. We got the intent by the Treasury Minister that he would address this by the end of this Parliament. That was his intent. That there wasn't, to my mind, a firm commitment. There needs to be, and this needs to be resolved. When everybody knows the state of the health service and the lack of funds and things like this should be easily addressed.
So presumably then the Treasury Minister must have some concern about introducing this. I mean, has that concern been expressed? Maybe well, it's the stated aim of government to bring more people to the island. So it is the concern that a health levy of some kind is going to put people off?
Well, in fact, he did say that it might worry people from wanting to come to the Isle of Man. But my understanding is if they come from beyond the CTA, they will have to contribute to the UK anyway. So I don't think what we're doing is unreasonable. I mean, really, what I wanted to do was address the existing disparity in fees and costs associated with people immigrating to the Isle of Man. And it is my duty as a politician to look after those people who have paid into the system, who are my constituents and other residents, and make sure they get a fair deal, if you like.
Tynwald wasn't all just questions and answers, though I'm sure some MHKs wish it was. We also had the Infrastructure Minister announce that she's scrapping the idea of a housing association in favour of a government-run housing agency. In effect, her department commissioned what's known as the Altair report. It cost almost £80,000 to produce, and that recommended the creation of an independent arm's-length housing association. But she raised a number of concerns about that, saying it lacked clarity on key operational issues like accommodation costs, office location, and access to central government services. So with this new housing agency, the Infrastructure Minister isn't ruling out the potential of a housing association entirely, but thinks this new agency will be a vital step towards it. And before you jump onto Facebook, tag Michelle Hayward and start ferociously typing about how much more money will be allocated to her department as a result, well, you can just hang fire for a moment because she promised it won't place any additional burden on taxpayers beyond what's already budgeted.
What I was surprised at when I started talking to officers within housing is actually there were a number of plans that were sat in drawers that just hadn't been progressed because the department stepped back from providing any more housing for reasons I cannot actually define what those are. And there is a surplus that we receive in terms of social housing revenue that is not currently being reinvested. That opportunity is there and that's what we should be using.
What's next, I wonder? Well, shall we talk about the item that caused Tynwald to bleed into a third day? Sure, let's talk about Laurie Hooper's motion into Manx Care's mandate and operating plan. He delivered some of the strongest criticism we've heard in the chamber this administration. What his motion sought to do was throw out those two key documents and tell the government to return to the drawing board and start over. But he raised a particularly interesting point during his opening remarks.
I am having this debate in absolutely no expectation that it is going to succeed. And the reason for that is there are 10 ministers and a departmental member in this chamber and only 22 members of the House of Keys are present, which means there is no way that we can outvote the government. What that means, honourable members, is this vote is a vote of conscience more than anything else, because the outcome is predetermined. The government will win this vote because they have the numbers. It means the rest of us get to vote freely. And that's important because when we all go back to stand in front of our constituents, we can't say, well, we were pushed into it by the government. Because I'm telling you at the outset, it doesn't matter which way you vote in terms of the outcome, but it's going to matter the way you vote when you go and talk to your constituents about how you represented their interests in this place. Those also raise some serious questions about the ability of Tynwald to hold government to account when they have an automatic veto power, when we are down by as few as 2 members in this honourable House. That is something that concerns me and should concern everybody.
Now, that debate lasted more than 10 hours, and it would be tricky to summarise and do it justice, but in essence, we had some MHKs and MLCs raising serious questions about the content and direction of health. Naturally, government ministers defended it, as would be expected because of collective responsibility, which is what Mr Hooper was just talking about then. That basically means all ministers must vote together in the chamber. Breaking rank is very rare. It hasn't actually happened in this administration, at least. But think of it like the whip in the UK, where if you're a member of a party and receive a 3-line whip, it means you must vote with your party or face consequences as tough as suspension from the party. Ultimately, though, when we strip back all the criticism and backpatting, the one underlying theme that rings out is everyone in the chamber claims they all want the health service to do well. How it gets there and achieves that is another matter. After the mammoth debate had concluded and Mr Hooper had lost, as he predicted, I caught up with him.
Well, I knew going in that the Council of Ministers had enough numbers to block the vote because they have 10 ministers plus their department members and there are a couple of people absent. So I wasn't going into this with any expectation of winning. What I was kind of hoping for was that a couple of ministers would vote with their conscience and break ranks. Ultimately, that was the ultimate hope, but I thought that very unlikely. But the purpose of doing this, and one of the members asked, why didn't we just do this in March? The purpose of doing this was so that everyone could cast a vote, which wasn't an opportunity that was offered to us. So now when we go out to our constituents and we can talk about what we've been doing, and anyone can ask us, did you support this? We can quite categorically say, this is the side of the fence that I was on. I didn't support what was happening now to the health service. Others did, but it's up to them to justify now to their constituents, which isn't something they would have to do if we'd have just had a general debate back in March.
Just to go slightly off-piste, obviously the automatic government majority, do you think that highlights some wider concerns with the actual constitution?
Yes, absolutely. So in a proper parliament, you would have a party structure whereby the government would have a majority, but it would be by party affiliation, and so you would know going into the election and coming out the other side what you're getting. Here you have a majority of a government that actually isn't aligned with anybody, has no public mandate, and yet they have the power to just do what they like, essentially, simply because, as was the case in this sitting, 2 members happened to be absent or away on other business. And when you've got such a small parliament like that, you can't afford to lose 1 or 2 members on debates that are sometimes as critical as this. So have a government having an automatic veto of things, I think, is very unhelpful. I think it puts us entirely in the pocket of the Council of Ministers, and I don't think that's the way to run a proper democratic parliament.
The Health Minister did claim that the mandate is not about cutting services, but was about adapting to modern clinical practice. Some other members said this document was about tackling issues head-on. Do you think there's any truth in that?
No, none whatsoever. I mean, if you read through the document itself, I spent 10 minutes in my summing up reading out lines from the mandate that explicitly talk about reductions or constraints in service delivery. I don't know what planet the Minister is on, but that document is very clearly about reducing services. Now, they may have very noble aims, and the reason they're doing this is because they only have so much money. And again, the document is very clear. They're saying we've got this much money and we're going to reduce services to match the amount of money that we think we're going to spend. That is definitely one approach. It's not the approach I believe in. I believe that we should be making this transformational change, but it should be taken over a longer period of time, which allows for a more gradual impact on patients, but would inevitably cost a little bit more money. That's the reality. And that approach is what we were taking over the last 3 years, and it was working. As a number of members highlighted today, that approach works, and we know it works, and we know it's sustainable. The approach they're taking now is risking having a serious impact on a lot of people, just so they can tick a box and say, well, we've come in on budget. But as I also outlined, the budget they need is more than they've asked for. They've been quite clear about that in the documents as well. Tynwald gave them £357 million, and they're looking to spend something in the region of £380 million. There is no secrecy here. They're being quite upfront about it, that despite these service cuts, these constraints in activity, these reductions in services, they are still going to spend more money than Tynwald authorised them to spend.
The Health Minister did strongly reject the idea that there's a push towards privatisation, describing private care as a matter of patient choice, not a replacement. You've repeated throughout that there are contradictions in what's being said versus what's actually written in the document.
Yes, that is absolutely the case. And the problem that you have is, yes, private care should be a choice for someone. So if you've got the option to go on the NHS or go private, absolutely that should be a choice for you. But when the choice you're being presented with is there is no NHS service, so you have to go private, that isn't a choice. So if you're an adult who needs an ADHD diagnosis, the health service is now saying, no, sorry, you're on your own, you have to go private. If you need respite care, for example, if you need support in that space, the mandate is explicit. We are not going to be looking at enhancing that service, and so you'll need to find alternative solutions. So if the Minister is being genuine and saying private care is about a choice, she has to offer a service on the NHS so patients can actually have a choice. What we're seeing in this mandate is not a choice, it is a reduction in NHS services at the same time as they're saying, but don't worry, you'll be able to go private. That isn't a choice, and that actually isn't a choice that many people will be able to afford. And that's the horrible truth here, is private care is fine if you can afford to pay for it. If you can't afford to pay for it and there is no NHS service, you simply don't get treated.
Something that was particularly interesting was what the Attorney General said, that the debate actually and motion has no legal basis to prompt any change if it was approved.
Tynwald motions have no legal effect. There are some occasions where they do, but by and large, Tynwald motions are what we call declaratory. They are expressions of opinion, they're expressions of will. That doesn't mean government can ignore them. And this is where the politics of it all kicks in, because the law is quite clear, like it is with the budget. It must be laid before Tynwald. It doesn't need to be approved, just laid. But there are lots of very good reasons why you want your Parliament to approve a budget document, why you may want a Parliament to approve a significant shift in policy. And government and members regularly bring motions to Tynwald that have no legal basis but are expressing Tynwald's wishes and Tynwald's will, and then it's up to government to go and do that. Obviously government have to do that in accordance with the law. So in this case, if I was successful, government would have had to go to the department and say go and negotiate with Manx Care to change the mandate in line with the Manx Care Act. Nobody was suggesting that they do otherwise. In fact, the only people today that have openly admitted that they are possibly in breach of the law, we've had an assertion from Mr Thomas at the Treasury in respect of loans, maybe not having complied with one particular law. I know that I've made an assertion that the Health Department haven't complied with the Manx Care Act in putting this together. I've asserted in the past that maybe the Public Services Commission hadn't fully complied with a piece of law. The government has a track record here of, I would describe it as not complete compliance with various bits of legislation. And so really for them to stand up and start trying to fall back on, but you have to follow the law as an excuse when that's, in this case, a massive red herring, I think is a little bit disingenuous of them.
And naturally, the Attorney General has to be impartial in what he's saying, and his advice is purely on a legal basis. But do you feel like what he said there, not maybe unhelpful is the right word, but that did sway some members to voting against?
It did, and actually, you're right, the AG is impartial. He's just providing legal advice. He's doing his job as a Crown officer, representative of our constitutional position, really, more than anything else. But this is an issue that I've raised in the past. So I sit on the Constitutional Legal Affairs and Justice Committee, and I did in the previous administration. And one of the criticisms I have of our current setup is when Mr Attorney stands up to speak, he will give a legal opinion. Now, we're not all lawyers in that room, and so we may misunderstand the consequences and the context of that legal opinion, which is what happened today. Members standing up saying, well, if this has no legal force, I can't support it. Well, of course it doesn't. It's a Tynwald motion. They don't have legal force. What are you talking about? And that's the issue. But people tend to take proclamations from the Attorney General as being gospel. That is how the law works. Now, my experience of lawyers, if you talk to two lawyers, you might get three opinions. That's the way the law works sometimes, and that's perfectly okay. But because the Attorney General is there, he's a member of the court and he has that position, it elevates him automatically to a level where people will take him seriously, which we should, but we have to remember to put any advice we get in the right context. So my position on that is the Attorney General shouldn't sit regularly as a member of Tynwald. He should be able to be called in or come in if he has particular advice to give. But sitting there as a member of Tynwald actually elevates him perhaps into a place where he ends up being politicised to some extent, and that's kind of what happened today. He made a very straightforward legal point to make sure people understood that motions like this aren't legally binding. Fair enough, that's perfectly correct. But people took it as a political point, saying, well, you shouldn't approve it because it isn't legally binding. And I think that is a nuance that was lost on some members today. And that is, like I say, purely because of the particular position the AG finds himself in. And I'm quite nervous that he gets politicised, because like you've said, he is impartial. It is very important that the Attorney General remain impartial. And, you know, if his legal advice does start to get politicised like it was in this debate, it does put some of what he has to do as his job, you know, makes it difficult, I think.
And just lastly, I suppose in many ways when factoring in the government's automatic majority and the advice given by the AG, this was very much a symbolic debate more than anything else. So what would your message be to all the MHKs and MLCs who voted against what your motion sought to challenge?
Well, the message I'd give to them is exactly what I said at the end. When services start changing, which they must change, but when people are being told, sorry, there isn't the money to send you across for treatment, like we saw in January where those cuts were made, when we start seeing people say, actually, I need an advocacy service, sorry, we're not going to roll one out. You know, if you get people saying, well, how about access to diabetic retinopathy? Sorry, no, that's been pulled. We're not going to be developing that anymore. When people are told, sorry, your surgery has been removed, delayed, reduced because of constraints on our financial position, I think those members that supported all of those decisions should stand up and say so, and should tell their constituents, yes, I supported constraining elective activity, which means the waiting list has got longer, and that's what happened. They should say that. They should say that Manx Care told me there is a risk if you do this, waiting lists will significantly increase.
increase. That's the language in the mandate. And I was happy with that risk. That is what people should, that is what MHKs who supported the government in this motion should tell their constituents. I guarantee you they won't. I guarantee you they will point fingers and blame everybody else under the sun. But the reality is those that supported the government today have enabled this and have supported that to happen. And when that does start happening over the next 12 months, which the mandate clearly says it's going to, I think they really owe it to their constituents to stand up and are duty bound to be honest and say, yes, that's what they voted for.
Minister Claire Christian rejected claims of a drift towards privatisation, but patients are increasingly reporting that they've been forced to go private due to excessive delays in receiving NHS care. I began by asking her what she'd say to those people who feel privatisation is being crept through the back door.
What we've got to do is we have to listen to our patients. You're absolutely correct, and listen to those circumstances. And I would encourage them to come forward and talk to me about that. I am working obviously with with Manx Care about reducing the NHS waiting times and looking at that and setting and adhering to the standards. And that's what we'll be focusing on over this next year, and looking at those. The matrix of what they have to adhere to, and monitoring that so that these circumstances become less often.
And you just said you're speaking with Manx Care about reducing waiting times. The last time that was done, there was a £20 million synaptic bill. Could we be expecting another private provider to come in to sort those waiting times out again?
We're not looking at that at the moment, no. We're obviously looking at efficiencies within Manx Care to reduce those waiting times.
If people are suffering and appointments are being cancelled or delayed for significant periods of time, what do you expect them to do in the interim between now and Manx Care actually actioning those reductions in the waiting list? Do you expect them to just wait around, or is it reasonable to expect them to take matters into their own hands and go private?
It's definitely, obviously, the standards of waiting times. In an ideal world, Christian, to have no waiting times is something that is impossible around the globe for an NHS service. So there are expected waiting times. I think we have to be realistic about that. But I would certainly reassure the public that the waiting times are based on clinical decisions. So it's always the most important are put first, and that is really important to stress that. And if any patient, as I said, has any concerns, they should contact MCALS, Manx Care, to get that reassurance that those clinical decisions are being made.
Laurie Hooper described the mandate as a huge assault on frontline services and believes it could lead to an unacceptable reduction in care. He thinks the government's not being honest. Can you guarantee that no core services will be lost or degraded as a result of this plan?
So I think it's really important to understand that the change of the way services are delivered is not necessarily a reduction. So it's where the right place, the right person, the right time, and that's really what they've been looking at. And as I've explained prior in other interviews, it's about community care, bringing that service back into the community and closer to home. As I've explained, what that means is for example, when you are referred to for an operation perhaps in the UK and to one of our tertiary providers, and then the referral appointments don't have to happen in the UK, and they can happen perhaps here or either virtually or with your GP. And I think that's really important, that's something that we are looking at in terms of making efficiencies, and also it's better for the patient to not have to do that exhaustive travel journey to the UK for a 10-minute follow-up appointment. So that's obviously with our tertiary providers, but we also I've talked more about bringing care closer to home in terms of your GP, accessibility to GP appointments. And the way that we're doing that is to give you more varied services within your GP. So whether that might be a physiotherapist or whether that might be a mental health professional, you don't need to be referred by your GP. You can see those clinicians actually at your GP. And what that does is that frees up the GP appointments for for the people that really need it. What I've seen just in the 20 weeks that I've been here, Christian, is in place is, patients have not been able to get that GP appointment. After some time, they might eventually go to meds, and then after some time, they eventually end up in A&E. And this isn't not upon anything. It's not good customer service. It's not good patient experience. But upon everything else, it's also costly because we're paying for that 3 times. We're paying for the GP to see that person and they're not able to. We're paying meds to see that person and they do, but might not be the right requirement. And then obviously then they end up in A&E, and so we're paying for it possibly, but sort of 2 or 3 times. And if we could get that appointment initially, early intervention at the GPs, obviously that then helps and frees up our acute services in A&E, and that's essentially what we're focusing on, or what Manx Care are focusing on.
If the motion had passed and your amendments had failed, although motions obviously aren't legally enforceable, would you have listened to Tynwald?
So, I thank the Attorney-General for his contribution and clarification on the constitutional boundaries surrounding the Manx Care mandate and the operating plan, making it clear the original motion under the mandate would have had no legal basis nor effect. And I think it's important that a lot of the members really listened to that, and that was something that was important, that actually we have a Manx Care Act for that reason. But and this is it's all intrinsically linked, because actually the previous motion, which I removed to look at the governance of the Manx Care and Manx Care Act, would actually look at those things and actually look at how we can improve that. And that's something that's really, really important. I know we probably want to talk a little bit about the reason we didn't move that motion, but I think it was definitely the right decision after you saw, as we said, sort of 3 days of debate, and a lot of what was spoken about actually were nuances of the Manx Care mandate that were causing issues. And it's not until you've got something that's actually working in place that you can see that improvements need to be made. And that's what's really, really important.
I mean, that applies to all motions. A motion is basically just an opinion of Tynwald. It's not a legally and binding thing by any stretch. So that means the budget, like Mr. Hooper said, all motions across the board are exactly the same. They don't bind you. So I'll just ask you again, if it had passed, would you have felt a kind of moral responsibility to listen to Tynwald?
I think absolutely we have I have a moral obligation to listen to the debate, to what Tynwald says, to the vote, and absolutely we would have listened to what happened, and we do. And I think I'm pretty open and transparent. I hope I am, but we're not all going to agree on things, and I think that's where it's important that we have these debates. And we understand that Tynwald, whilst we don't agree on every policy decision, it's really important that we air that, and I'm so pleased that the way that everybody spoke over those 3 days, because it was so actually we've come away. I know I've come away, and I think other people have come away thinking actually that there are some really good ideas and solutions out there.
Do you think it's fair that governments can have an automatic voting majority on things like this? Because Mr. Hooper did allude to the fact that his motion was almost certainly going to be defeated unless Comyn broke collective responsibility. I
mean, that's politics. Obviously, that's something that this is the way the system is set up in Tynwald. I've been both on both sides of the table in terms of a backbencher when my motions haven't met the majority. I think it's important you have a majority, because you have to have the majority support. What Mr. Hooper was implying was because some members were away and not present at the Tynwald sitting, and that unfortunately caused perhaps what he thought was an imbalance.
If nothing else, the fact that the Council of Ministers can have an automatic majority when some MHKs are given leave is a particularly interesting talking point, and it raises wider questions about the strength of the Constitution. Let's look at that in a bit more depth, and who better to discuss that prospect with than veteran political commentator, former government press officer and journalist Alistair Ramsey.
I don't think it has an absolute majority built in. It does have to take other departmental members on any particular issue with them. But no, nevertheless, it is a very dominant force. Most of the other members are members of government departments, so they are members of government, broadly speaking, albeit semi-detached members of government. And again, this comes back to the authority that Council of Ministers has. The public has not voted for them to be the government. We do not vote for a government. We just vote for our constituency representatives. There is an argument that the Isle of Man is a form of one-party state. The fact that the non-ministers are called backbenchers suggests they are all actually members of one big party. It's a pretty loose party, but they have private briefings where they're all addressed as if they are inside the tent rather than out, which I think is a very, very unhealthy cultural habit that they have, but they think it's perfectly reasonable.
Why do you think it's unhealthy?
Well, I sat in them for 18 years. It took me most of those 18 years to think, hang on, this is not really normal. I can't see this happening anywhere else, where the entire Parliament sit in a room and discuss matters of policy and legislation. They don't vote on it, but it's part of their consideration is done behind closed doors. Nowadays, they do release some information, afterwards, or they can do if they want. But it adds to that kind of one-party feel to the thing, and it can be abused. I mean, there was an occasion in the past over the nationalisation of the steam packet where a sitting of Tynwald was basically stitched up by agreement at a previous private briefing, and that was an abuse of parliamentary protocol, and I think it really at that point left the Tynwald without much integrity.
And do you think that the reason those private briefings happen is to almost try and pull back some of the backlash that could happen in the chamber?
Oh yeah, it's very useful for government because you can float ideas with the members, you can get their feedback, you can adjust things if necessary. So you can see why they do it. The members appreciate it because they like to have more information than the public has. So when government makes an announcement, their constituents say, "What's all this about?" And they can say, "Well, I can tell you what it's all about." And they like that. They like to be on the inside when it suits them, and they like to be on the outside when things go wrong.
The application of collective responsibility often means that departmental members are also expected to abide by that too. In some cases, you could even have as many as 14 votes in favour of something in the Keys before anything has actually been said. Would you call that a democracy?
No, it's questionable. I would say that the collective responsibility to amongst departmental members isn't always observed or enforced very strictly. Quite often you'll see departmental members kind of going off reservation, and you think, well, how are they getting away with that? But no, it isn't healthy, and it's not that democratic. I think there's an issue, and Lord Lisvane pointed this out, about the number of members of Tynwald who are also members of government departments. It's a complete imbalance. I think that MLCs shouldn't be members of government at all. Their function should be to stand back from government and to scrutinise and challenge it on policy as well as legislation. And I think, non-ministers should be more independent and shouldn't... Okay, some of them can take departmental roles, but there should be a limit on the number of MHKs who are also members of government.
Obviously, Laurie Hooper resigned as the Health Minister in October, and he's since become one of the fiercest critics of government. It definitely doesn't mince his words. He thinks that the ability of Tynwald to affect change is severely limited. Is he right there?
Yes. And I think not just because of the dominance of the Council of Ministers, but because actually it is very difficult to get a coalition of 24 or even 33 to actually agree on anything and move forward in any particular direction, which brings us back to the lack of a kind of direction from the public.
Now, we know he submitted evidence to the Constitutional and Legal Affairs and Justice Committee, which is investigating the issue. Could we see some major reforms to the way the executive branch functions and how it interacts with Parliament? Who knows? Probably wouldn't be done in any rush, and it would have to be compelling for politicians to consider overhauling the way they've operated for the past 40 years. That's all for Perspective this week. You might be glad to know that Phil Gaughan will be back with you next week. So until next time, Gurmayad, take care, bye-bye for now.